From New York City, this is Louis A. DeCaro Jr., and this is John Brown Today. In the first installment of John Brown's Jewish Associates, we met Bondi, Benjamin, and Wiener, and observed how they were drawn into the struggle of Bleeding Kansas as allies of the abolitionist Brown family. So let's continue. Based on the testimony of Salmon Brown in later years, the killings along the Pottawatomie Creek were undertaken by Brown by dividing his company into two squads. The first squad, comprised of his sword-wielding sons Salmon and Owen, escorted the three Doyle men from their home into the darkness, dispatching them with swords no more than 200 yards from the house. The other squad, comprised of son-in-law Henry Thompson and Theodore Wiener, accompanied Brown to the home of Allen Wilkinson, another pro-slavery conspirator and a member of the territorial bogus legislature. Brown supervised the arrests, but once more stood back as Wilkinson was marched into the darkness of night and cut down. Finally, Thompson and Wiener appeared at the home of Dutch Henry Sherman, only to find he was absent. Instead, they seized his brother William, who was a co-conspirator as well, but spared two guests who were in their home and were not party to the conspiracy. While Brown's son Frederick waited in the Sherman house with these guests, Henry and Wiener escorted William down to the creek where they killed him. In later years, Salmon Brown, who was again one of the killers, characterized Wiener as a, quote, big, savage, bloodthirsty Austrian that could not be kept out of any accessible fight, end quote. Perhaps Salmon was exaggerating Wiener's profile, for Salmon himself proved no less savage when it came to killing these pro-slavery thugs than had Wiener. But there was some truth in his remarks. Wiener had skin in the game. He hated Sherman and his brother. He deeply resented their hostility and had come to hate the local pro-slavery people for their threats, insults, and violence. Wiener was Polish, not Austrian, but he was a big man and a fighter, and of all the Pottawatomie killers, he was perhaps more driven by personal animus and bitterness than were the rest of the party. Now, I'm not suggesting that Brown, his sons, and son-in-law did not have their own lethal intentions, and please don't take my words as if I'm demonizing Wiener. First, understand that Brown led and directed the killings, but as in most things he did so with an intentional martial form as a leader. In Kansas and later in Virginia, Brown is always a leader, a commander. This is not pretense or ego on his part. It is, for him, the only legitimate form of resistance, organized and led by a responsible commander, often with paperwork to boot. Second, the Pottawatomie Company, as led by Brown, was made up of two components. Those who went along, such as Townsley, whose wagon and teams were used to convey the killers, as well as Brown's other sons, Frederick and Oliver, all of whom came along in support but did not participate in the killings. The other component was comprised of four men who acted as soldiers: Owen, Salmon, Henry Thompson, and Theodore Wiener. None of these men were kowtowed or browbeaten. None of them lifted a sword while being, as the late Stephen B. Oates so incorrectly asserted, under some kind of spell. All four of these men knew exactly what the mission was about and did not need to be persuaded or spellbound to kill these five thugs on Pottawatomie Creek. All four men knew there was a life and death crisis upon them, and they agreed with John Brown and wielded ferocious swords to prove it. That Wiener needed no persuasion or rationale to kill Wilkinson and Sherman is not to single him out, only to emphasize that historians should stop portraying the Pottawatomie killings as an act of one man. The killings were the act of a team led by John Brown, and four soldiers in particular, with every intention of doing exactly what they did. That Wiener was the only one not in the Brown family is a point of consideration, just as is the fact that he was perhaps the only other man in the party who had good reason to fear for his life. And the fact that killing them was, for Wiener, as much the culmination of a blood feud as it was a preemptive strike. Nor was Wiener's role in the killings a secret. Local Free State people were well aware that he had both lent brawn and steel to the effort, so much so that a local person named O.C. Brown, who happened to be the founder of the Free State town of Pottawatomie, in later years described Wiener as having, quote, led the part in the tragedy as the one most aggrieved, end quote. In the following month of June 1856, we find both August Bondi and Theodore Wiener once more fighting at John Brown's side. In early June, when pro-slavery forces led by the spiteful Henry Clay Pate met Brown's men at Blackjack, his two Jewish allies were part of that resistance. Bondi later recounted the somewhat humorous story of how he and Wiener ran across the battlefield with Missouri bullets whizzing past them. Wiener, a heavy-set man, says Bondi, was huffing and puffing as they ran up a hill that was just south of Pate's troops. Amidst the fighting, recalled Bondi, they both seemed to have sensed the comedy of the moment. "Well, what do you think now?" Bondi asked Wiener. Despite his heavy breathing, Wiener managed a wry response, only in Yiddish. "Was soll ich denken? What shall I think? Zu Adam Malvis. I think the end of man is death." Bondi also says that after the hardships of that summer in the field with John Brown, Wiener lost a lot of weight, too. Of course, John Brown defeated Henry Clay Pate and his forces, despite being outnumbered, and the Battle of Blackjack became one of the most famous episodes of John Brown's Kansas story. After the victory, Brown held Henry Clay Pate and his lieutenant, whose name was Brockett, as prisoners, and awaited an exchange of Free State prisoners. During this lull of a couple of days, Bondi recalls that another fight nearly broke out between Wiener and his pro-slavery prisoner. According to Bondi, on the morning of June 4th, 1856, Brockett was mouthing off at Bondi, and the two men began to argue. The problem was doubtless Brockett's doing, given he was an aggrieved and defeated pro-slavery chump, and he resented finding what he perceived as Germans or Deutschmen among Brown's men. While there were men like Dutch Bill Sherman among the pro-slavery people, there was a sizable German immigrant community in St. Louis that were anti-slavery people and who were despised for it. Given his form of so-called nativism, Brockett was blowing off racist steam when he challenged Bondi, saying, "What does a damn Dutchman know of liberty?" At this, Wiener, who was nearby, exploded in rage and jumped into the conflict. Wiener returned the insult at Brockett until a fight almost broke out between them. Brockett in turn challenged Wiener to a duel, and Wiener was ready to take up the challenge when John Brown interrupted the whole quarrel and demanded them both to shut up and send them both back to their tents. But it's interesting to learn, too, that Wiener and Brockett had met before, according to Henry Thompson. Wiener had encountered both Pate and Brockett only months before while in Kansas City. According to Thompson, which he probably learned directly from Wiener himself, Pate and Brockett had an open conflict with him, perhaps right out on the street, if not a brawl. So when Brockett, as Brown's prisoner, started insulting his friend Bondi, it was probably no coincidence that Wiener was watching and ready to jump in. By the way, Bondi says this Brockett was a vile fellow in his own right. He had led a massacre at an Indian post and had committed other outrages. Happily, Brockett was taken prisoner during the Civil War by the 6th Kansas Company, court-martialed, and executed. At any rate, looking back at the Battle of Blackjack in June of 1856, August Bondi would later write, "Blackjack was the Gettysburg of the Kansas struggle. God was there, John Brown was there, and the Jew was there with John Brown." The year following John Brown's death, which would be 1860, August Bondi was married to Henrietta Einstein, a Bavarian immigrant who had settled in Leavenworth, Kansas. When the Civil War started, Bondi was appointed First Sergeant of Company K, 5th Kansas Cavalry, and was honorably discharged in 1863 after having been wounded 3 times. Throughout his career, Bondi held several public offices, including a registrar's clerk for the U.S. Land Office, a constabulary judge, and he was a director of the Kansas Historical Society. On September 30th, 1907, at the age of 74, while walking down the street in St. Louis, August Bondi collapsed and died. We know little about Jacob Benjamin, Bondi's business partner and clothier. Well, we do know Benjamin went on to serve during the Civil War as well, and he was part of the 11th Kansas Regiment and died the year following the end of the Civil War in 1866. What about the strapping bellicose Theodore Wiener? Well, when the Civil War began, Wiener also enlisted to fight for the Union cause. But after the war, it seems he left Kansas for an extended time. According to the testimony of local Kansas settlers, Wiener returned to the territory, now the state of Kansas, in 1870. One of those settlers, Martin Van Buren Jackson, recalled talking to Wiener about the Pottawatomie killings. Now, Wiener was understandably tight-lipped about the episode, but he felt comfortable with Jackson, who later said they spoke at length about the killing of the Doyles, Wilkinson, and Sherman. Wiener, Jackson said, told him that the killing of those 5 men, quote, was a blessing to the settlers of that part of the territory and saved them from a raid from the ruffians at the time, end quote. A decade later, Wiener was sought out by a lawyer from Lawrence, Kansas, named John Hutchings. Hutchings was then researching the Pottawatomie killings and was looking for contemporary testimony. According to the Kansas historian James Malin, in January 1880, Hutchings found Wiener, now an aged man of 74 years, living in Lynn County. His account of the meeting, conveyed by Malin, is worth reading directly from the text. According to Malin, Hutchings explained to Wiener that recently an anti-Brown writer, and that was G.W. Brown, no relation to John Brown, had drudged up the killings at Pottawatomie, and so it was necessary to get to the exact truth. Hutchings further explained to Wiener that, quote, no danger would come to him in consequence of his revealing the whole facts within his knowledge, that the legislature had passed amnesty laws covering all alleged crimes committed during those days, end quote. After reading the testimony of Townsley, who had conveyed Brown and his men in his wagon, Hutchings asked Wiener, you don't say you were not along, do you? The evidence shows that you were with the party, and Townsley says you were there, end quote. At first, Wiener denied it, saying they must be referring to another man of the same name. When Hutchings pressed upon him, citing other undeniable testimony, Wiener, quote, became a little excited and said, gentlemen, let me say to you in plain English that all your evidence don't amount to hell room. I tell you, I know nothing about the matter, end quote. At this point, Hutchings concluded it was evident that we were up a stump, so he then prepared to leave. As this happened, Wiener courteously remarked that he was sorry he could not give us the information we sought. Hutchings concluded that Wiener is evidently a man of good education and understands himself pretty well. Writing to a Kansas colleague afterward, Hutchings admonished, I think if you were to see Wiener and talk with him, he might be disposed to tell what he knows. I have not given up trying him again, end quote. But apparently, Theodore Wiener was never willing to speak of his role in the Pottawatomie killings, as did, for instance, Salmon Brown and Henry Thompson in later life. There's no evidence that Hutchings or anyone else ever spoke to Wiener again. In fact, he died in 1906 and was interred at the Jewish cemetery in St. Louis. However, according to the master grave locator, Rich Smith, Theodore Wiener's resting place has yet to be identified. Thus, the story of John Brown's Jewish associates in the troubled time of territorial Kansas. As August Bondi put it, God was there, John Brown was there, and the Jew was there with John Brown. May their memory be for a blessing. From New York City, this was Louis A. DeCaro Jr., and this was John Brown Today.